Margaret sacrificed everything for her son's education, paying every cent of his college tuition. But when graduation day arrived, she wasn't invited. Her ex-husband received the invitation she had earned through years of sacrifice. The reason? A mistake that shattered their family and left wounds that seemed impossible to heal. This is a story of love, betrayal, and the long journey toward forgiveness. Margaret stared at the empty mailbox for the third time that week, her hands trembling slightly as she closed the metal door. The silence of her small apartment felt deafening. As she walked back inside, her footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors she had installed herself after the divorce. She had been expecting something, anything, from her son David for months now. A letter, an invitation, even a simple phone call. But nothing came. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent the last 4 years working double shifts at the hospital, taking on extra weekend shifts as a nurse, sacrificing her own comfort and social life to ensure David could attend the prestigious university of his dreams. Every semester she had transferred exactly half of her paycheck to cover his tuition, his books, his dormitory fees. She had eaten ramen noodles for dinner more nights than she cared to count, just to make sure he had everything he needed. And now, as his graduation approached, she felt like a stranger in her own son's life. The realization hit her like a physical blow when she discovered the truth through a casual conversation with her neighbor, Mrs. Henderson. The elderly woman had mentioned seeing Margaret's ex-husband, Robert, at the local dry cleaner, picking up what appeared to be a formal suit. When Margaret had looked confused, Mrs. Henderson had explained that Robert had mentioned attending a graduation ceremony. That's when Margaret knew. David had invited his father, but not her. The betrayal cut deeper than any scalpel she had ever handled in her medical career. It wasn't just the lack of invitation that hurt. It was the complete erasure of her sacrifices, her love, her unwavering support throughout his academic journey. She had been there through every late-night study session, every failed exam, every moment of doubt. She had believed in him when he had stopped believing in himself. But she also knew why she had been excluded, and that knowledge carried a weight that threatened to crush her spirit entirely. 3 years ago, Margaret had made the worst mistake of her life. Her marriage to Robert had been slowly deteriorating for years, filled with long silences, separate bedrooms, and conversations that never went beyond the weather or household logistics. She had felt invisible, unloved, and desperately lonely. When their neighbor, James, had begun paying attention to her, offering genuine conversation and emotional connection, she had fallen into an affair that lasted 6 months. The discovery had been devastating. David, home from his freshman year of college, had witnessed the moment Robert confronted her about the affair. The look of disgust and disappointment in her son's eyes had haunted her every day since. In that moment, she had lost not just her marriage, but her relationship with the person she loved most in the world. The divorce had been swift and brutal. Robert had been granted the house, and Margaret had moved into a modest apartment across town. David had barely spoken to her since, their conversations limited to brief exchanges about tuition payments and academic requirements. He had chosen his father's side, and Margaret had accepted that as her punishment for destroying their family. Now, as she sat in her quiet apartment, surrounded by the remnants of a life she had once loved, Margaret felt the full weight of her isolation. She had sacrificed everything for her son's education, but she had also sacrificed her right to celebrate his achievements. The guilt was a constant companion, whispering reminders of her failures as a wife and mother. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts, stopping at David's name. Her finger hovered over the call button, but she couldn't bring herself to press it. What would she say? How could she explain the depth of her regret, the magnitude of her love, the desperate wish to be part of his life again? Instead, she opened her laptop and began typing a letter she wasn't sure she would ever send. "My dearest David," she began, her fingers moving slowly across the keyboard. "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, and I know I have no right to expect a place in your life after what I've done. But I need you to know that not a single day passes without me thinking about you, worrying about you, and being proud of everything you've accomplished." She paused, wiping away tears that had begun to fall. The words felt inadequate, too small to contain the enormity of her emotions. "I destroyed our family, and I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life. But I have never stopped being your mother, and I have never stopped loving you with every fiber of my being. I worked those extra shifts not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to give you the future you deserved. I wanted to prove that even though I failed as a wife, I could still be the mother you needed." Margaret stopped typing and walked to her bedroom closet, where she kept a small box of mementos from David's childhood. She pulled out his kindergarten graduation photo, his little face beaming with pride, as he wore a miniature cap and gown. She remembered how excited he had been that day, how he had insisted she take 100 pictures, how he had asked her to frame his favorite one and put it on her nightstand. That same photograph still sat on her nightstand, though now it felt like a relic from a different life. She returned to her laptop and continued writing. "I remember when you were 5 years old, and you announced that you wanted to be a scientist. You spent that entire summer collecting rocks and leaves, convinced you were going to make some groundbreaking discovery in our backyard. I knew then that you were destined for something special, something far greater than anything I could have imagined for myself." The memories flooded back, each one a bittersweet reminder of the closeness they had once shared. She remembered teaching him to ride a bike, staying up all night when he had the flu, driving him to soccer practice every Saturday morning for 6 years. She remembered his first day of high school, how nervous he had been, how she had slipped a note into his backpack, telling him how proud she was of him. "I watched you grow into the brilliant, compassionate young man you are today, and I know that your success is entirely your own. You earned every grade, every achievement, every opportunity through your own hard work and determination. I was just lucky enough to be there for part of the journey." Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw it was from David. But her excitement quickly turned to confusion as she read the message. "Mom, can we talk? I'm coming over." She stared at the message for several minutes, unable to process what was happening. David hadn't been to her apartment since she had moved in 3 years ago. He had never expressed any interest in talking to her about anything beyond the practical necessities of his education. 20 minutes later, she heard a knock at her door. When she opened it, David stood in the hallway, looking older and more mature than she remembered. His dark hair was neatly styled, and he wore a button-down shirt and khakis that made him look more like a young professional than a college student. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "David," she whispered, stepping aside to let him in. "I'm so surprised to see you." He walked into her living room and looked around, taking in the modest furnishings and the carefully arranged photographs that chronicled his life from birth to his last high school graduation. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he said, settling into the chair across from her couch, "about everything that happened, about how I've treated you, about what's really important." Margaret felt her heart racing. She had dreamed of this moment for 3 years, but now that it was happening, she felt unprepared and vulnerable. "I know about the extra shifts," David continued. "I know about the overtime hours, the weekend work, the sacrifices you made to pay for my education. I never thanked you for that. And I should have." "You don't owe me thanks," Margaret said quickly. "I did what any mother would do. No, David replied, shaking his head. You did more than that. You did more than most mothers would do, especially considering how I've treated you. I've been angry for so long, Mom. Angry at you, angry at Dad, angry at the whole situation. But I've also been angry at myself. Margaret leaned forward, her attention completely focused on her son's words. I was angry at myself for judging you so harshly, for refusing to see you as anything more than the person who broke our family apart. I was angry at myself for not recognizing that you're human, that you make mistakes, that you were probably just as hurt and confused as the rest of us. Tears began to form in Margaret's eyes, but she fought to keep them from falling. I've been in therapy, David continued. My college has a counseling center, and I've been working with someone there to try to understand my feelings about everything that happened. She helped me realize that I've been punishing you not just for what you did, but for not being perfect. And that's not fair. David, I don't deserve your forgiveness, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. I made a terrible mistake that hurt everyone I love. I broke our family, and I understand why you've been angry with me. But that's the thing, Mom, David said, his voice growing stronger. I don't want to be angry anymore. I'm tired of carrying this resentment around. It's not serving anyone, and it's definitely not serving me. I graduate next week, and I want you to be there. Margaret felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She had spent so long accepting her exclusion from his life that the possibility of inclusion felt almost impossible to comprehend. What about your father? She asked. I know he's planning to attend. Dad will be there too, David said. And yes, it might be awkward, but you both deserve to be there. You both played important roles in getting me to this point, even if those roles were different. Margaret finally allowed her tears to fall, years of suppressed emotion flooding to the surface. I'm so sorry, David, she said. I'm sorry for the pain I caused you, for the way I destroyed our family, for all the time we've lost. I would give anything to take back what I did. I know you would, David said, moving to sit beside her on the couch. And I'm sorry too. I'm sorry for shutting you out, for refusing to see your side of things, for not acknowledging everything you've done for me. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 3 years of separation and pain settling between them. Can I ask you something? David said finally. Anything. Why didn't you fight for me? After the divorce, after everything happened, why didn't you try harder to maintain our relationship? Margaret considered his question carefully. It was something she had asked herself countless times over the past 3 years. I thought I was protecting you, she said. I thought that by staying away, by not forcing you to choose between your father and me, I was doing what was best for you. I thought I had forfeited my right to be part of your life when I made the choice to have an affair. But you never stopped being my mother, David said. Even when I was angry, even when I was saying terrible things about you, you were still my mother. You still loved me. You still supported me. You still believed in me. I never stopped loving you, Margaret confirmed. Not for a single moment. Every day I wondered how you were doing, whether you were happy, whether you needed anything. I wanted to call you, to text you, to show up at your dorm room and make sure you were okay. But I was afraid that would make things worse. David was quiet for a long moment, processing his mother's words. I need you to know something, he said finally. What happened between you and Dad, that was between you and Dad. It had nothing to do with me, and it shouldn't have affected our relationship the way it did. I was wrong to punish you for problems in your marriage that I didn't understand. Margaret felt a shift in her chest, as if a weight she had been carrying for years was finally beginning to lift. I also need you to know that I've forgiven you, David continued. Not just for the affair, but for all of it. For the divorce, for the pain, for the way our family fell apart. I forgive you because I love you, and because I want us to have a relationship again." The words hit Margaret like a physical force, and she found herself sobbing with relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving me another chance." "We're giving each other another chance," David corrected. "I haven't been perfect either. I've been stubborn and unforgiving, and I've wasted 3 years being angry instead of trying to understand." They talked for hours that day, sharing stories and memories, discussing the pain of the past and their hopes for the future. Margaret learned about David's girlfriend, Sarah, whom he had been dating for 2 years. She heard about his academic achievements, his job prospects, his dreams of attending graduate school. In return, she shared her own struggles with loneliness and regret, her efforts to rebuild her life, her pride in his accomplishments. As the sun began to set, David prepared to leave. "The graduation is next Saturday at 2 o'clock, he said. "I'll make sure you get an invitation." "I'll be there," Margaret promised. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." The week that followed was the longest of Margaret's life. She purchased a new dress, had her hair done, and spent hours imagining what the ceremony would be like. She was nervous about seeing Robert, about the potential awkwardness of the situation. But she was also filled with an excitement she hadn't felt in years. The night before the graduation, David called her. "I wanted to ask you something," he said. "Would you like to go to dinner with me and Sarah tomorrow night, after the ceremony?" Margaret's heart swelled with joy. "I would love that more than anything." "Great. There's a restaurant downtown that Sarah has been wanting to try. Nothing fancy, just a nice place to celebrate." "David," Margaret said, "I want you to know how much this means to me. Being included in your graduation, meeting Sarah, having dinner together. It's more than I ever hoped for." "Mom," David said, "I want you to know something too. I've been thinking about everything you've done for me, and I realize I never really understood the magnitude of your sacrifices. Working all those extra shifts, sending me money when I know you barely had enough for yourself, supporting my dreams even when I was treating you terribly. That's not just what any mother would do. That's what an extraordinary mother does." Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes again. "I also want you to know that I'm proud to be your son," David continued. "You made a mistake, yes. But you're also one of the strongest, most resilient people I know. You've rebuilt your life after losing everything. You've maintained your dignity, despite everything that happened, and you've never stopped loving me even when I didn't deserve it." "You always deserved it," Margaret said firmly. "You're my son, and my love for you has never been conditional. I know that now," David said, "and I'm grateful for it." The morning of the graduation dawned bright and clear. Margaret dressed carefully in her new navy blue dress and the pearl necklace that had been her mother's. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman who had survived loss, betrayal, and isolation, but who had also found her way back to what mattered most. She arrived at the university early, wanting to find a good seat and mentally prepare herself for seeing Robert. The campus was bustling with families, all dressed up and carrying cameras and flowers. Margaret felt a pang of sadness as she watched other families gathering together. But she also felt a deep gratitude for the opportunity to be there at all. She found a seat in the middle section of the auditorium, where she would have a clear view of the stage. As more people filed in, she spotted Robert entering with his sister and her family. He looked older, his hair grayer than she remembered, but he was smiling and seemed genuinely happy to be there. Their eyes met across the auditorium, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Margaret felt her heart skip a beat, unsure of what to expect. But Robert simply nodded at her, a gesture that seemed to acknowledge her presence without hostility. It wasn't warmth, but it wasn't anger either. It was acceptance, and that was more than she had hoped for. The ceremony began with the traditional processional, hundreds of graduates filing into the auditorium in their caps and gowns. Margaret scanned the crowd, looking for David, her heart racing with anticipation. When she finally spotted him, walking with his chin held high and a smile on his face, she felt a surge of pride so intense it took her breath away. This was her son, her brilliant, accomplished son, crossing the threshold into the next phase of his life. Despite everything that had happened, despite all the pain and mistakes and lost time, he was here, and she was here to witness it. The ceremony proceeded with speeches from faculty members and distinguished alumni. Margaret listened politely, but her attention was focused entirely on David, sitting in the third row with his fellow graduates. She watched him laugh at the speaker's jokes, applaud for his classmates, and look around the auditorium with genuine happiness. When his name was called, Margaret stood up and applauded as loudly as she could. David walked across the stage, shook hands with the dean, and received his diploma. As he walked back to his seat, he scanned the audience until his eyes found hers. He smiled and gave her a small wave, and in that moment, Margaret felt as if her heart might burst with joy. After the ceremony, families gathered outside the auditorium for photographs and congratulations. Margaret waited patiently, unsure of the protocol for this new dynamic. She watched as other graduates found their families, as parents hugged their children and posed for countless pictures. "Mom!" She turned to see David approaching, his graduation cap in his hand and his gown flowing behind him. He wrapped her in a tight hug, and she felt years of tension and sadness melting away. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered into his ear. "Thank you for being here," he whispered back. They separated, and Margaret saw that Robert had approached as well. The three of them stood together in an awkward triangle, unsure of how to navigate this unprecedented situation. "Congratulations, son," Robert said, embracing David. "You did great up there." "Thanks, Dad," David replied. There was a moment of silence, and then David spoke again. "I want to take some pictures with both of you," he said. "Separately and together. This is my graduation, and both of my parents are here. I want to remember that." Margaret felt a wave of emotion at his words. Despite everything that had happened, despite all the pain and mistakes, David was choosing to include both of his parents in this moment. It was a gesture of maturity and forgiveness that took her breath away. They took pictures for nearly an hour, with various combinations of family members and friends. Margaret met Sarah, David's girlfriend, who was warm and welcoming despite the potentially awkward situation. She also met several of David's friends, who all seemed genuinely fond of him and respectful of his family. As the crowd began to thin, David approached Margaret. "Are you ready for dinner?" he asked. "I've been ready for 3 years," she replied, smiling. The restaurant David had chosen was a small Italian place downtown, with checkered tablecloths and dim lighting. Margaret, David, and Sarah sat at a corner table, sharing stories and getting to know each other. Margaret learned that Sarah was studying to become a teacher, that she and David had met in a literature class, and that she was from a small town in Ohio. "David talks about you a lot," Sarah said at one point during the meal. "He just told me about your work as a nurse, about how hard you've worked to support his education. I can tell how much he loves you." Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. "He's told you about me." "Of course," Sarah said, looking surprised. "You're his mother. He's incredibly proud of you." Margaret looked at David, who was smiling at her across the table. "I've always been proud of you, Mom," he said. "Even when I was angry, even when I was saying terrible things, I was still proud of you. I just didn't know how to express it." The conversation continued late into the evening, covering everything from David's graduate school plans to Margaret's hopes of traveling someday. It was the kind of easy, natural conversation that Margaret had dreamed of having with her son for years. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, David hugged both women goodbye. "This has been the perfect day," he said. "Thank you both for being here, for supporting me, for making this so special." Margaret drove home that night with a heart full of gratitude and hope. The apartment that had felt so empty and lonely for years now felt like a place of possibility. She had her son back, not just as an obligation or a duty, but as a genuine relationship built on love and mutual respect. Over the following months, Margaret and David slowly rebuilt their connection. They talked regularly on the phone, sharing details of their daily lives and making plans for the future. David included her in his graduate school decision-making process, asking for her advice and input. He brought Sarah to Margaret's apartment for dinner, and the three of them developed a comfortable, loving relationship. Margaret also began to forgive herself. Through therapy and reflection, she came to understand that while her affair had been a terrible mistake, it didn't define her worth as a person or as a mother. She had made an error in judgment during a difficult time in her life, but she had also demonstrated strength, resilience, and unconditional love in the years that followed. The relationship with Robert remained cordial but distant. They occasionally found themselves at the same events related to David's life, and they were able to be civil and even friendly. The anger and resentment that had defined their divorce had faded into a quiet acceptance of their shared history and their continued role as David's parents. A year after the graduation, David called Margaret with news that filled her with joy. "Sarah and I are engaged," he said. "We're planning a wedding for next spring, and I want you to be there. I want you to be part of it." Margaret cried tears of happiness as she congratulated her son and his fiancée. She had feared that she might never see David married, never meet her grandchildren, never be part of the family milestones that make life meaningful. "I would be honored to be part of your wedding," she said. "I can't wait to celebrate with you." As she hung up the phone, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost everything 3 years ago: her marriage, her son, her sense of self-worth. But she had also gained something invaluable: a deeper understanding of love, forgiveness, and the power of second chances. The affair had been a mistake that she would regret for the rest of her life, but it had also been a catalyst for growth, for healing, for the rebuilding of relationships that were stronger and more honest than they had been before. Margaret had learned that redemption wasn't about erasing the past or pretending that mistakes hadn't happened. It was about acknowledging the harm that had been done, taking responsibility for it, and working to build something better from the ruins of what had been lost. She had also learned that love, true, unconditional love, could survive betrayal, anger, and years of separation. It could lie dormant, waiting for the right moment to resurface, but it never truly disappeared. As she looked toward the future, Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. She had her son back. She had a daughter-in-law who loved and respected her. And she had the possibility of grandchildren who would know their grandmother as a woman of strength and resilience. The graduation that had once seemed like a symbol of her exclusion from David's life had instead become the beginning of their reunion. It had been a day of endings and beginnings, of loss and restoration, of the kind of hope that can only come from the deepest forgiveness. Margaret had sacrificed everything for her son's education, but in the end she had gained something even more valuable: the chance to be his mother again, not just in name, but in every meaningful way. And that, she realized, was worth every sacrifice she had ever made. The story of Margaret and David became a testament to the power of love to overcome betrayal, the importance of forgiveness in healing relationships, and the truth that redemption is always possible for those who are willing to do the hard work of rebuilding what has been broken. In the end, Margaret learned that being a mother wasn't about being perfect. It was about loving unconditionally, supporting relentlessly, and never giving up hope, even when that hope seemed impossible to sustain. She had failed as a wife, but she had ultimately succeeded as a mother, and that success had been worth every moment of pain and every tear of regret. The graduation was just the beginning. The real gift was the relationship that grew from that day forward, built on a foundation of mutual respect, genuine forgiveness, and a love that had proven itself stronger than any mistake.